You know how we always talk about borders as if they're these permanent
Right,
things?
like lines drawn on a map, set in stone.
Exactly. But get this, melting glaciers are actually making countries redraw their
Yeah,
maps.
it's not about politics this time. It's about the Earth itself changing. And that's what's so fascinating.
It really challenges how we think about geography, doesn't it?
For sure.
Hmm.
We think of borders as static, but what's happening in the Alps, it shows just how vulnerable they are to the environment, especially with climate change.
It's like the ground is literally shifting beneath our feet. Speaking of, our friends at SpySat News brought this to our attention. They had an article about Switzerland and Italy and how they're going to have to redraw part of their border because the glacier that marked it is melting.
Wow.
Can you imagine waking up one morning to find out that, oh, a chunk of your backyard now belongs to a different country?
Yeah, that's wild. And this isn't just some obscure thing happening in a corner of the world. This sets a precedent.
Right. This is how climate change is going to start impacting geopolitics all over, don't you think?
Absolutely. This is a big deal.
So break it down for me. How does a melting glacier actually cause a border dispute?
Okay, so for centuries, the border between Switzerland and Italy in this region, it's been the watershed on this glacier. Basically, where the meltwater flows down one side of the mountain or the other.
Makes sense. Natural boundaries and all that.
Right, exactly. But as the glacier shrinks, that line moves. So what was once Italian territory might now be on the Swiss side of the meltwater.
And that creates confusion over who's responsible for what, right?
Exactly. It's not just lines on a map. It's about who responds to emergencies, who maintains it, even who has the right to build there if it's no longer covered in ice. Real practical stuff.
Wow. So it affects people's everyday lives in a real way.
Oh, absolutely. And this is happening in some iconic parts of the Alps near the Matterhorn, impacting those famous ski resorts and those mountain shelters too.
It's changing the landscape in such a real way.
It is, but to their credit, Switzerland and Italy are trying to stay ahead of this thing. They've got a joint commission, and they drafted an agreement to redraw that border section based on the new terrain.
Oh, that's good. Are both countries on board with that?
Switzerland has signed off, and they expect Italy to follow suit. How smoothly this goes could really set the tone for other places dealing with climate change and border issues.
It's a big deal, like you said. And this isn't just in the Alps, is it? What happens as sea levels rise and coastlines change? Are we talking about redrawing maps all over the globe?
Yeah, absolutely. And it's not just coastlines. Think about rivers. Those form natural borders too, right? What happens when their flow changes because of droughts or floods?
Both of which are becoming more common with climate change.
Exactly. It highlights how interconnected all this is. Environmental changes impacting global politics.
Yeah.
It's a domino effect.
And it's not just about the lines on a map, but what they represent. Resources, access to water, even important cultural sites. Things could unravel quickly.
They could. And they are in some parts of the world. There are already fights over fishing rights because the fish are moving due to the warming waters. And then there's the potential for conflict over fresh water as these glaciers disappear.
Yeah, that's a huge concern. It's a lot to think about. But going back to the Alps, the SpySat article, they said 2023 was the second worst year for glacial melt in Switzerland. A 4% loss in just 1 year, that's huge.
It is. And they had that record-breaking 6% loss in 2022. Imagine if your savings shrunk by that much in 2 years.
Talk about a wake-up call, right? How do scientists even measure how much of a glacier melts? Do they have people climbing around up there with tape measures?
That's a good question.
Yeah.
And a lot of people probably wonder the same thing. They actually use a bunch of ways. Satellites can see changes in the ice. They put sensors around to track movement and melt water. And they even look at old records to see how things compare to the past.
It's like a detective case, but for a vanishing landscape. And this is where it gets really interesting, because the SpySat article, it mentioned that all this melting ice, it's led to some unexpected discoveries, like they've even found human remains near the Matterhorn.
Yeah, it was a climber from Germany who had been missing since 1986. It really makes you think all these melting glaciers are revealing secrets, some of them tragic, that have been frozen for decades.
It's like the mountains are giving back pieces of history, but not in a way anyone wants. Fascinating and kind of sad at the same time. We talk about these melting glaciers like it's some far-off issue, especially those of us who don't live near mountains. But you mentioned the same things that are fueling things like hurricanes, and that hits a lot closer to home for a lot of people.
It does, and it's all connected. Yeah, like take that hurricane that just hit North Carolina. That was awful. Warmer air, the same thing that's melting those glaciers. It also makes storms stronger
Right, and then there's the jet stream, changing because of climate change too, and that can cause those storms to just stall out over land.
and dump all that rain, more than they've ever seen. It's all connected.
So those glaciers in the Alps, they might seem a world away, but it's a reminder that what happens over there affects everyone, right?
Exactly. And it shows why this whole border thing between Switzerland and Italy, it matters. It makes us think about these very real impacts of climate change, how we manage stuff, share land, even how we define what it means to be a country when the actual ground is changing.
It's like climate change is rewriting all the rules and we're just trying to keep up. And what's crazy is that they can see these changes from space, right?
Oh, yeah, they've got these satellite images, and they're watching it happen year after year, these glaciers shrinking. It's like watching a landscape disappear and fast forward. And it's not just about, like, how it looks. The glaciers disappearing changes everything. Water resources, ecosystems, and, like we've been saying, geopolitics.
And for the people who actually live in those regions, it's their homes, their jobs, their whole way of life that's being affected.
Totally. Like imagine communities that depend on that glacier water for drinking, for their crops. If the glaciers are gone, that's their lifeline. Gone too. You're talking about people maybe having to leave their homes, economic hardship, even conflict, because those resources are disappearing.
It really shows how climate change is a human issue, not just something that affects the environment.
And it's not some problem for the future. It's happening right now, everywhere.
So what can we do about it?
That's the question, isn't it? There's no easy answer. We have to cut down those greenhouse gases, adapt to the changes already happening, and really rethink how we do things on this planet. It's a lot.
It's like we need to be more flexible, more resilient, and definitely more willing to work together as a global community if we're going to figure this out.
Absolutely. We can't think of borders as these fixed lines anymore. They're going to have to be more fluid. We've got to work together and take care of this planet together. We need to be smart about how we share resources and remember that what impacts one of us impacts all of us.
And the biggest thing is we have to act now, because the longer we wait, the worse it's going to get, right?
100%. What we do today determines the kind of world we leave for future generations. It's a big responsibility.
It is, but it's a conversation we can't ignore. So for our listener who asked about glaciers and borders, what's the key thing you want them to take away from all of this? What do they really need to understand?
Watch those glaciers. What's going on in the Alps right now, it's just a preview of what we're all going to be dealing with as climate change changes our world.
It really makes you think, if a glacier completely disappears, does that border just vanish?
It's a tough one. We might see this debated in courts and stuff for years to come. It shows just how much we need a more, adaptable way of thinking about borders with climate change changing everything. Like, if something that marks a border just disappears, how do you even decide who owns what?
It's like we have to redefine what a border even is, right? We always thought about nations and borders as permanent things, like the natural world was this fixed thing. But this glacier situation, it shows that nothing is really permanent.
Right.
And it's not necessarily a bad thing.
No.
It's just different. We have to rethink how we do things, be ready to adapt, find new ways of working together on this planet.
I agree. It's a chance to build a better future, a fairer future, but we have to be willing to face these problems head on. We have to be open to new ideas.
So true. Okay. As we wrap up our deep dive on these melting glaciers and moving borders, what's the one thing you really want our listeners to remember? What's the big takeaway?
I'd say remember that the future isn't set in stone. No pun intended. Our choices are going to determine what happens. Stay curious, stay informed, and get involved because the world is changing fast and we've all got a part to play in shaping it.
That's a great note to end on. We hope this deep dive has given you a new way of looking at how climate change is impacting things and what it could mean for all of us. And until next time, keep asking those questions.